So it was the first day of kindergarten, and I was there to drop off my son. Now, for some kids who had not spent much time away from mom or dad, or who've never been in a classroom with a bunch of complete strangers, that can be a rather traumatic experience. I remember one young boy was weeping and wailing, and he was attached to his mother's leg with a death grip. He was wrapped around her like an anaconda. He was begging her not to leave him there with all those people he didn't even know. She literally could not pry him off of her leg. The mom looked up at me helplessly and said, "Arthur does not deal well with change." Well, I could sympathize with Arthur, so I bent down to him in my best Mr. Rogers voice. I said, "Hey, buddy, look, there's a bunch of cool art stuff over there and a lot of nice books over there. And everyone feels this way on their first day of school, more or less." Arthur looked up at me and said, "Shut up." And he went right back to weeping and wailing. So his mom was right. Arthur did not deal well with change. Well, several years later, I could still sympathize with Arthur. Elle and I were on a road trip together. Not far off our path was this small town where I'd spent my early growing up years. I hadn't been back there in decades, and she agreed to join me on this trip down memory lane. It always felt so good to remember the quiet street and the small house where my family had lived, the public pool where I took swimming lessons during the summer, my old elementary school, the church I attended, the ballpark where I played Little League, the town square with a majestic courthouse surrounded on all sides by quaint little shops and restaurants. I was excited to revisit those familiar things again. In my memories and even in my dreams, images of that town played on kind of a nostalgic, comforting loop. My family had moved away from there not long before I reached adolescence, when we all go through plenty of changes and we begin to explore who we are in the world. So I had grown up and changed and had been through a lot since then, and the world seemed to be getting more complex and confusing at an ever increasing pace. But just knowing that small town of my childhood was there and picturing it being the same brought me this nice, comforting sense of stability and peace. But as we drove into town, I knew things were different when we were met by a gigantic Walmart parking lot and a string of chain fast food places. It all seemed so out of place and just wrong. I never imagined those ugly pieces of modern American culture would ever despoil the landscape of my perfect little childhood paradise. But that wasn't the end of it. Everything I remembered as large appeared to have shrunk. The courthouse was still there, but it was a lot shorter and shabbier than I recalled. The shops on the courthouse square were now selling these junky trinkets. The swimming pool and the ball field, where I spent so many wonderful summers, was now an industrial park. My old home had been torn down and replaced by a college dormitory. My old street didn't even exist anymore. It was a parking lot. My old church, which had seemed so tall and elegant and shiny and new when I was a kid, now sat like this small, sad remnant of its former self. It looked practically abandoned. Now, if that was the march of progress, it was pretty depressing. It actually made me angry. How dare they change the cute little hometown of all my daydreams and memories, of all that I held near and dear? I complained to Elle about it, but then it hit me. David does not deal well with change. That little side trip was a reality check that change is inevitable, and change is not always something I'm going to appreciate. It pointed to the truth that what we hold near and dear in our hearts and minds, that what we value as stability and security, is a reality we construct inside of our heads. It's an ideal that might not always align with the way things really are. Little Arthur throwing a tantrum on the first day of kindergarten, and somewhat grown up David throwing a somewhat milder fit because my expectations of a long ago hometown didn't meet up with reality. Those are such small examples of how we handle everything the world throws our way. Sometimes we try to handle it by retreating or escaping from reality. I've done that before. It's pretty common when you're faced with a change that's causing too much emotional wear and tear or fear. You can deal with it by practicing avoidance. You try to eliminate the thing that's causing you pain by removing it from your field of vision. You know it's still out there, but you just choose to avoid it, not address it. I saw a video online recently of a man. He was being harassed by a bully on a subway. Now, it's true, it can be really dangerous to intervene in a situation like that, but apparently the subway trip had been perfectly normal and quiet until this bully began verbally harassing this poor guy. Another passenger pulled out their phone to make a video of this happening, but everyone else on the train just sat there staring straight ahead or down at their feet. Avoidance, not wanting to risk anything. Until an older woman, about half the size of this bully and at least twice his age, went up to him and in no uncertain terms told him to shut up, leave that man alone, and sit down, which he did. Everyone else on the train cheered and clapped. At least they supported her bravery, even if they didn't participate in it. So I watched that and I thought, what would I have done? Because I'm pretty good at practicing avoidance, at retreating from or escaping reality when the reality of change becomes just too much. Now, maybe I would have behaved like that woman and told that bully to stop. I'd like to think I would do that, which is another way we can respond to change. There are times when we do rise to the occasion, even when the outcome of our actions are not obvious. They're not sketched out for us. But even if we do know the likely outcome, it's still not a bad thing to challenge changes that are causing harm. One of the heroes we lost last year was the legendary congressman and civil rights leader, John Lewis. Now, of course, John Lewis was an agent of change. He used himself, and he was willing to sacrifice his own body to protest racial discrimination in the South. One bloody Sunday, March 7th, 1965, he led a march from Selma to Montgomery to demonstrate for voting rights. The route took the peaceful marchers across the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama. John Lewis and the marchers knew that the Alabama State Police had recently changed their tactics to being more overtly aggressive and violent to civil rights protesters. Because the system of racial bigotry and suppression the state troopers represented did not respond well to change either. But in the face of that change, the demonstrators marched anyway, and John Lewis was beaten, struck on the head multiple times with a billy club. He almost died. He knew that could be a likely outcome of facing the change and being an agent of change. It was all part of what he called getting into good trouble. But usually change feels like it happens to us, not that we have a hand in causing it, which is really a false assumption. Of course, we participate in change, and we even lead change. It's inescapable because time does not stand still. We grow up and we grow older, and in one way or another, we're always starting the first day of kindergarten, whether we want to or not. And every day, we're leafing through the mental photo album of the hometown we once knew and loved. We're looking at and trying to navigate a world that no longer contains the same pictures that brought us comfort and peace. So, what do we do with all that? Escape it? Avoid it? Challenge it? shake our fist at it? Since the world is always changing, whether we feel like bystanders or we feel like agents of change, and either way of being can be stressful, it's important to be aware of a greater reality. And that is our inner reality, how we are feeling, how we are coping, and what our attitude is about change. Although to call it only an inner reality makes it sound kind of small, when in fact, it's the biggest thing in the whole world. One day, Jesus was sitting with his disciples at the temple complex in Jerusalem. Now, the way Mark describes the story, this happened just days before Jesus was arrested and tried and crucified. So at that point, on that day at the temple, he almost certainly knew the outcome of his own habit of getting into good trouble. Jesus tells the disciples to look around at the temple and the whole complex of buildings. It was enormous. Even today, the platform where that temple was located still stands. It is 37 acres in size. The temple itself soared 150 feet high, 14 stories into the air, gold trim around polished stone. It looked like it would last forever, and for everyone it represented not just the presence of God, but the rock-solid, majestic stability of the promise that God would always be with them. But Jesus says, look around at this place. It looks pretty solid and permanent, but not one of these stones will remain. All will be thrown down. And he was right, by the way. About 40 years later, the Roman army did tear it down during a war when the Jews rebelled against the Roman occupation. But on that day, later on with his disciples, Jesus continues this discussion. The disciples want to know when such an amazing change is going to happen. How will they know how to anticipate that? How will they know how to handle it? It seems too amazing to even consider their world could ever change that much. So Jesus warns them that, one leader or another might come along in the meantime claiming to know it all and to have all the solutions and to have the ability to chart out the future precisely. But Jesus says that's foolishness. Change is coming. Change is always coming. And change is now. Now, to our ears today, and probably for the disciples, all of that can sound a bit scary, but I think Jesus was simply pointing out reality. He knew something we all know if we're simply alert to it, that in the midst of any change that challenges us, what matters most is our connection to the much larger inner reality that we share with each other. Jesus spoke of it so many times when he said, "The kingdom of God is within you." The hope, the courage, the joy, the healing, and the peace of God is within you. The love of God is within you. And still today, it's within me and within you and within all of us if we pause long enough to breathe it in and live into it. That reality flows like a river through any change and carries us along in the currents of change and gives us the strength and the endurance to be the agents of change. It even gets us into good trouble for the sake of any righteous change that shares and makes God's kingdom a reality for all people. Together, that is exactly what we're up to as a church. We're not created or called to retreat or return to ways of being that never change. No, our task is to engage and to serve and to love our neighbors as we are so loved. We are that lady on the subway who stands up and says, "Not on this train, Buster." We are the marchers crossing that bridge. We are the people who know that the world is changing and that the most powerful force in the universe is the hope, the courage, the joy, the healing, the peace, and the love of God that never stands still. It's within us and within everyone we meet, and that only needs to be awakened. Our job, our cause, is to embrace that. with that river of love flowing through us, we're going to deal well with change. And just imagine the positive and sacred difference we'll make in our relationships, in our community, and in our world. A change is coming, and we can make it a change for the better.